No mai hoki mai ki a the fold, e mihi ne ko Duncan Greive, tōku ingoa, and kia ora, welcome Glen.
Morning Duncan, unexpected morning.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an emergency podcast, as will be clear from the title, but we were messaging yesterday afternoon. There was they're not called tweets, they're called truths, but President Donald Trump put out a message, and it's, you know, it had a lot of content, or it felt very relevant to our beat, but you always have to pause a minute to say, like, how will this land? How seriously should it be taken? And then it became pretty clear pretty quickly that, you know, there was some substance to it, and it's dominated a lot of news ever since. I wonder if, Glen, thank you for joining us at such short notice, but I wonder if you could read the initial volley from the desk, you know.
Yeah, for sure. So a cheeky Sunday evening tweet from Mar-a-Lago by President Donald Trump. So it reads as follows: "The movie industry in America is dying in full caps, a very fast death. Other countries are offering all sorts of incentives to draw our filmmakers and studios away from the United States. Hollywood and many other areas within the USA are being devastated. This is a concerted effort by other nations and therefore a national security threat. It is, in addition to everything else, messaging and propaganda. Therefore, I am authorizing the Department of Commerce and the United States Trade Representative to immediately begin the process of instituting a 100% tariff on any and all movies coming into our country that are produced in foreign lands. We want movies made in America again."
I mean, it's quite a lot, right? And it's also a little bit hard to decipher exactly where the lines are going to be drawn, but well, let's just start with what you take it to mean, and how it has broadly been received in terms of its scope.
Yeah, and I think it depends where you sit, whether you sit in the US and outside of the US, because I think there's potentially some different interpretations here. But certainly sitting inside the US, there is a sense, like if you look at Hollywood and Los Angeles, that it has been decimated over the years. There is not a lot of production happens nearly at the same scale as it did 20, 30 years ago. That has moved offshore because of the incentives and rebates and things available to movie studios. And within America, or particularly in LA, Hollywood is seen to be to blame to some degree for the cost of living and you know, different things that have happened. Equally, if you are a movie studio and producing a movie, you want to produce it for the lowest possible cost you possibly can, and so you're going to chase these incentives around the world. And a tariff, we haven't seen a tariff yet on a service. All the tariffs have been on goods crossing borders. This is not that. You know, movies are an incredibly complex supply chain, which we'll come and talk about. But and I think there is a real question mark coming out of Hollywood at the moment of whether or not there should be an incentive solution to this from the Trump government, perhaps to sit alongside the tariff, and that the tariff could be incredibly damaging to the movie studios at a very delicate time.
The very delicate time thing is important, I think, because, you know, if you look at, I think this year has so far gone reasonably well for, you know, as far as box office goes. You know, US box office, I think it's up 15-20% on last year. Last year was a terrible year, and it's still roughly, like, I think a third down on 2019 if you use that as a baseline for the pre-pandemic era. They've endured the pandemic, obviously, basically a total lost year in 2020 and a pretty soft one in 21. They've endured the writer strikes. They've endured the Palisades fire, which was obviously like right through the kind of where a lot of the sort of screen industry lives and works. And so you've got this, and they've also, you know, streaming's happened, and the whole, you know, Hollywood was once such a vital and powerful industry, but also symbol of kind of US cultural dominance, and is really humbled right now. And so on some level, it's a classic Trumpist thing where he's right about some big elements of this. You know, other countries have been eating their lunch by by going after the wholesale aspect of the music of the movie industry. New Zealand's absolutely one of them. In some ways, a pioneer of it with the Lord of the Rings trilogy and some of the legal and incentive-based changes we made through there. And at the same time, and this is, I think, such an important point, the US is a net exporter of movies, the retail product.
3-1.
To the whole world. There isn't a single territory where that isn't, where it doesn't have a surplus, effectively. And, you sort of go, well, that is a complex thing. There's definitely an argument to be made for trying to address that one way or another. But this medicine and arriving at such a delicate time it's really, really, if this does stick, because you think about, like movie theaters are hanging by a thread, and there's so many different pieces to this puzzle. A lot of the the streaming companies are just eking out a profit. Do they? Does it apply to a streamed movie as well as a theatrical release? Like there's so much to it. Do you want to talk, because in some ways WBD is like a perfectly exposed part of this, which the company that you normally ran for a chunk of the world. Talk through how this is landing or is likely to have landed there.
Well, there'll be a lot of scratching heads because the detail is light in terms of how this would first of all be executed. It's when you think about a movie being made, there is the IP or the idea. There is then a script written, there is a financing process, there is then pre-production, then production, then post-production, and then there's obviously the screening of the film, at which point would the tariff actually intervene, because each one of those blocks could actually be done in different territories all around the world. And there's a complete lack of detail on that at the moment. And,
and you sort of go, like, if the idea is that if any aspect of it happened outside the country, if you're trying to view this as like an imported, like let's think about a movie as like a car. A car can still be designed in Detroit. It can use IP, i.e. the brand.
Yep.
That like a Ford. A lot of the marketing, the distribution, a whole bunch of the functions are broadly analogous there, and yet it might be made in either assembled in Mexico or assembled in like Tulsa from a mixture of local and imported ingredients. They're really not that dissimilar, and yet it seems to have, until recent walkbacks, been at least hitting the car industry as if. If there's any part of it that's either assembled or manufactured overseas, then it's gonna hit you pretty hard if the same logic is applied to movies. And the other thing is that, if a car, it can be, there were reports of huge shipments going in just before the deadline. With a movie, it takes years in development, and a lot of the time with tariffs, it's like we just turned it on today. So if you've got something that you've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in, and it arrives, if it's scheduled to land in June, which is peak season, very reliant on
American summer.
Then Jesus, it just feels like this could be a cataclysmic, even an extinction level event for some of these kind of quite indebted, quite exposed companies.
Yeah, I think that's right. I once had a conversation with someone very, very senior in the studio business, and they described, because it's a hit business, right? And with a hit, you're going to get misses, and very difficult to tell what's going to hit and what's going to miss. But they described the process of greenlighting a movie to me as somewhat akin to going to the casino and betting on black versus red. It was that type of decision. And if you've got a movie, a major blockbuster movie these days, the production budget ranges between on average $200 to $300 million. Some more, some a little less, but they're enormous budgets.
There's been fewer and bigger bets lately,
and
which
bigger
almost
bets.
Makes them more exposed.
Which is cool. It's a blockbuster strategy, and it's a well kind of researched theory on movie production. But on top of that, you can expect up to 50% of the movie production cost on top to be spent on just marketing the film. And so if all of a sudden that production, that 250 million production just turned into a $500 million, it's not a bet you're going to take. Those movies may not get made and just not seen. And so what is also interesting is at what point would a tariff like this intervene in the cycle? If a movie has already been produced but not shown yet at cinemas, is that going to be subject to a tariff? Whereabouts along the kind of line would this intervene? Because what could happen here is you have a whole bunch of sunk money that studios are forced to then write off the film. It will never see the light of day. And then the potential of a huge slowdown in the content pipeline coming through cinemas.
And that's coming off two other massive slowdowns in recent time. And that's the thing that's it's almost head spinning to imagine what it must be like to sit there going, we can't be doing this again. You had the strikes, you had the pandemic, and then to be facing. No one can, if you've got any ability to pause money right now, you're pausing it until you have clarity. And even once you have clarity, do you really have it? Because it's such a, like a government that is, it's governing by tweet, by truth, the bomb. How do you invest?
Well, the uncertainty before this happened was devastating for the big movie studios, Warner Brothers, Paramount, Disney, from the day prior to the Trump inauguration through to, the last week or so, stock prices were all down, and that was largely due to the impact of tariffs hitting the ad market. You then add this shock, and I saw overnight all of the major movie studios, including Netflix this time, have all taken a hit in the last 24 hours because of the uncertainty. It is just not clear at all how Trump would go about actually executing this. And the one of the scary things is if they were to if other territories were to introduce reciprocal tariffs on the back of this, that given what you talked about, the positive surplus that the movie industry has in terms of exports, it could be devastating for the industry, let alone the precedent that it might open up for other service-based retaliatory tariffs around the world.
So one thing which I was listening to Irene Gardner, who's the head of SPADA, the Screen Producers Guild in New Zealand. She was on Morning Report today as we record, and it is like New Zealand is both a tiny market but an outsized force, particularly at that sort of ultra mega blockbuster level, because we have Peter Jackson and James Cameron both living here and producing some of the most heavily financed and kind of $1 billion plus expectation films here on various cycles. And she said, I expect that those kinds of voices will go and get this kind of thing sorted out. Now, credit to Irene, she's a very smart person. She may well have been saying that more in hope than in belief. But I guess my that sort of exemplifies the fear I have with it to me, which is that Hollywood, it doesn't have pull, like it's historically had huge political pull. And yet currently with this administration, Hollywood is overwhelmingly liberal. You look at the speeches at the Oscars, the donations they make, the spruiking they'll do for particular candidates. It's all kind of on one side. And you look at like James Cameron, right? He's a vegan who's left America, got an organic farm and is making movies in this country miles away. What part of that says Trump is going to be sympathetic to any entreaties from him, even if he loves, Terminator 2? And So there's this kind of the idea that, like, when you have something that's semi-neutral, like an Apple, or where the political coding is not as intense, then it feels like they have more power, let alone the fact that a lot of these studios are linked to news organizations, which he's got no great love of. So,
and he's suing.
Which he's suing, exactly. You see it with Paramount, the whole 60 Minutes, where you've got CNN. They're just everywhere. There is something that really pisses Trump and his people off. So why will he give them a sort of a decent hearing?
Yeah, so a couple of things on this. I think the Motion Picture Association, the MPA, who represent all the big studios, are still an incredibly powerful lobbying organisation around the world. They will be playing a role here in New Zealand in the background, for example, around some of the media reforms, that have been proposed. So they are a very powerful lobbying group still. Trump, interestingly, he announced 3 Hollywood ambassadors, remember?
Very specific group.
Yeah, and an interesting group, right? So Jon Voight, Sylvester Stallone, and Mel Gibson. Interestingly, Mel Gibson actually is about to make the second movie of The Passion of the Christ, and he's going to be making it in Italy, which would be subject to, obviously, these tariffs should they go ahead. But my understanding is that Jon Voight, in particular, was at Mar-a-Lago last weekend with his manager, and they were talking about the need to revive Hollywood, which is a good thing, positive thing. But their method of an approach on that was to create a federal incentive scheme. And what that would mean is, a bit like Australia, there would still be the state-based incentives where the states would fight over, trying to attract a production into the state. But over the top of that, they'd be able to access a federal incentive. And you have to think about that and go, actually, that would be a really positive thing, positive approach, as opposed to a tariff.
Yeah, I mean, and that would be what everyone in Hollywood prefer. And yet I sort of look at the way that they've approached, the Trump administration has approached, for example, higher education, or, just name an aspect of government. And there is a sort of that kind of progressive taint that is on both the front of camera and a lot of the sort of executive side. That's also sort of in the movie. So as soon as you have that, they're going to be scrutinizing these scripts, and these are very long running processes, and you sort of go, well, how? As soon as you do that, they're going to basically be asking that every movie is like the original Top Gun, in terms of being at a very America fuck yeah kind of situation, zero irony. And again, like, it's probably the worst possible time from a global perspective to be interfering in a propagandistic way in the filmmaking process. It's so fascinating.
Well, then you come back to what are the range of likely outcomes here on the back of this. On one spectrum, literally nothing, because this is so difficult to execute on so many different levels. On the other extreme, obviously, he just goes ahead and bowls ahead with tariffs, which actually feels to me unlikely again because of the difficulty in actually being able to execute that.
And where you draw the line, what it actually fundamentally means.
But it does feel to me like there'll be some tempering, and already in the last 24 hours, the White House has not walked back to say they're not going to do it. They've walked it back in the sense to say, hey, early stages, we're investigating, we're going to get the right people looking at this, and we're going to try and figure it out.
One thing which I think would be interesting from our perspective is, like, this is a relatively rare situation in terms of the kind of Trump blitzkrieg approach, where he's got a reasonable chunk of a point, and that I think everyone acknowledges that the incentive schemes aren't, if you could just get rid of them entirely, then that would be, obviously it'd be bad for Hollywood, but it'd be, it's like, you'd find a lot of people supporting that, both politically and in terms of just a broad fairness thing. It might not even necessarily be all that bad for New Zealand, because we're still a cheaper place to make things. Part of the reason we keep having to readdress our rebate scheme is because other people will sort of push it a bit further, even if they've got sort of higher cost bases and so on.
It's a race to the bottom eventually if you follow that thread all the way through.
Exactly. So, there's a world where if everyone kind of commits to rolling back that sort of narrow suite of rebates, but on pain of death effectively, at least death of your industry, then maybe that's not a bad thing for, the world in for trade, but it's actually relatively good for New Zealand.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, there's another side of this to go if on the back of a tariff it becomes uneconomic to produce a film or do elements of a film in pre or post-production. What does that mean for the likes of, Park Road Post and, Weta Digital and these other organisations that...
It sure looks like Peter sold that company at incredible... I mean, it was already looked very adroit timing with the rise of AI, let alone this kind of trade war mess.
Yeah. So I think you probably go back to a time where New Zealand is more an attractive production environment because of our natural beauty and the environment we have.
Relatively low wage, strong exchange rate benefit, which is a big thing, by the way. So absolutely the studios look at that exchange rate benefit as a significant, positive in terms of filming in New Zealand. But it probably also means that there will be more infrastructure built up in the US, which means less infrastructure required around the world. So, yeah, I mean, but basically the current status is, in classic Trumpian style, very extreme statement, somewhat walked back by, proxies. We don't know exactly what it's going to be, but an absolute, thunderbolt and an opening up of a new front, as you say, in services, which, the US is a massive exporter of everywhere. So it's a little bit careful what you wish for. At the same time, no one wants to kind of close off the biggest market in the world.
Well, the other really interesting, Trump's agenda, it's never quite clear exactly what he's trying to achieve when he says these things. But of note, one of the biggest production environments that's been built up over the last 20 years outside of the US is Canada. They've just appointed just voted in a brand new Prime Minister, and he is meeting with Trump this week. So you do wonder whether or not there are other things at play to try and create noise and also distract people from other things that are going on in the American economy.
Well, we have you here. There has been the big local media story of the year has been Jim Greenan's kind of I'm always trying to be careful how I describe it, but his attempt to kind of take over the board of NZME, and there have been there's some reporting suggesting that there might have been a kind of a compromise reached.
Yeah, Shane reported, was it last night, that...
Shane, who's on holiday right now.
Yeah, that's right. Shane reported that there, and it was not confirmed, we should say that, but it was insinuated that Barbara Chapman, the current chair, would step down, and that Steven Joyce was likely to be the new chair as a compromise, that Greive would no longer seek the chair role and just have a board seat.
Yeah. Well, is he still definitely going for the board himself personally?
It looked that way.
Right. And there was also talk that Des Giddings and Philip Crump would also go onto the board. But a mix of change and continuity, and rather than the sort of extremist, quote unquote, as he's been described at the top of it, you'd have a familiar figure who's also very kind of associated with a recent right-wing government, but has a phenomenal amount of media experience. Did you ever have anything to do with him? Because his company ultimately became part of MediaWorks.
Yeah, well, he did form MediaWorks. He bought, the radio assets together, and then ultimately the TV business to create MediaWorks.
This is Steven Joyce.
Steven Joyce, that's right. And, Sussan, who's currently on the NZME board, for example, will, absolutely have had a strong relationship with him over the time. But yeah, I mean, what a phenomenal figure, being able to create, local media company in the way he did. So deep media knowledge. It also really suggests to me, at least, that if this is true, that shareholders are likely to be appeased around the approach from Greive, and this seems to be an issue that was probably on the table for discussion between Greive and the shareholders, something to be resolved, if true, has been resolved, and would indicate that Greive's bid is likely to proceed.
It does, or at the very least, a version of it, right? And it's interesting because Steven Joyce is a current columnist for the Herald, writes in the Weekend Herald business section, and still a reliably kind of free market oriented, small government oriented critic of the kind of of politics generally, and particularly acerbic about the previous government. So he'll be very sort of acceptable to the kind of, if there was, and it seems fairly, it doesn't seem too long a bow to draw to suggest that part of what Greive and some of his supporters wanted was to see a kind of a bit of a political realignment, shall we say? They've described it as a greater commitment to the journalistic principles as laid out. But either way, I think that Joyce is a very interesting and well-chosen candidate because he's a very known figure. He was a huge part of the John Key government, ultimately finance minister towards the end. He has a very strong media background and one which where you just know how to make things popular. Like that's very obvious in his record. So he can be both relied on to do some of or want some of the same things as the sort of Greive and Bowker axis, but also execute them in a way that is not quite so, doesn't stoke fears of it being quite so inflammatory as people might have otherwise suggested potentially.
Yeah, I think that's right. He brings a level of balance to the conversation. The kind of, dare I say it, growing up in the room, sitting around some of these big decisions, and tempers, a lot of the concerns, frankly, that were out there.
And that's not the only NZME news. You've also seen James Butcher, who had only been in the Chief Commercial Officer role for, I think, maybe 15 months, announced that he's stepping down. Murray Kirkness has been appointed to the executive. That was actually a critique that was raised by Philip Crump in a Substack, and the lack of editorial representation at the exec was something that had been both of concern to the Herald shop floor, but also, it had been suggested that was symptomatic of the fact that journalism wasn't particularly, paid attention to or given the right level of scrutiny at the company. The exec, in fact, expands to 11 because you've also had Carolyn Louis depart recently. So what you're ultimately seeing with all of this is that you can see Butcher's departure as evidence that they're saying, yes, we see that there are commercial performance issues. Whether he's right to be kind of made scapegoat for them, I'm not saying that at all. But it's a bone for the insurgents. Same goes with Kirkness's elevation. What it does look like is there's been a lot of behind-the-scenes manoeuvring at the very highest level that is taking this towards a compromise that maybe no one is entirely satisfied with, but actually like they can all live with.
Yeah, I think we spoke about it on a pod quite early when we were talking about this as one of the things that was inevitable, regardless of whether Greive was successful or not, was that NZME would likely change its strategy or pivot. And I think we're seeing signals of that, aren't we, where they've leaned in very, very heavily given the structure that they had with, the editor reporting to Carolyn, on advertising, very, 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 very focused on that. And these moves would suggest actually we're going to pivot back into the importance of audience into our future, and something you and I have talked ad nauseum about, right, in terms of the operating models. And so it is interesting to think about that board meeting to go, if NZME are taking these steps, is that to appease shareholders for the upcoming vote around board seats? And would they be satisfied, or are they more satisfied still with Greive's approach now that the potential compromises have been made on the chair?
Well, and those, again, there's sort of two strands to Greive's approach, right? One of which is a sort of an attack on the journalism. The second is we should pull One Roof out and potentially list that separately. Jarden are reportedly still exploring that, according to the Australian yesterday. So this thing remains live, and it's been a very exciting episode. It looks like it's winding towards a relatively peaceable conclusion, but still a lot to kind of be revealed, I think, in the coming days.
Yeah, I think the one next thing to look for is, do you see ahead of that AGM, proactive resignations from members of the board? And so that is potentially, the final signal to say, actually, this is done.
Yeah, there's been one of those. That certainly there is potential for there to be some more to come. Thanks, Glenn. Jesus, there's so much going on in this embattled industry, but fun to talk about. Thanks for coming up.
You're welcome.